Okay, thank you, and welcome back to the after lunch sessions. And thank you to Beata for asking me to chair this session. I'm not going to read out the biographies of the speakers, but they're in the back, so you can take it from me. They're all extraordinarily expert and distinguished in their own fields, and they're all brilliant. So I leave it at that. This is an interesting area, looking at board composition and directors' duties, and it reminds me of a statement that Professor Coates from Harvard said when he was talking about corporate governance, and he said, well, corporate governance is not rocket science. It's actually harder than rocket science, because when you talk about rocket science, you're talking about inert material moving through space, but when you're talking about corporate governance, you're talking about companies which are comprised of groups of people trying to work together. So you have the idea, which you were referring to earlier, what makes people tick, and then you have the group dynamics, so that explains it. So some of the people who are going to talk about the issues and the difficulties from this particular agenda. So the first speaker is Dr. Vincenzo Bavoso from Durham. Thank you.
Okay, my proposal is, as you can read from... as you can read from the title, so my idea, how can we achieve sustainable companies? By creating what I call enlightened boards, which is combining private and public interest. So how do we do that? Or why, first of all? If we look at what happened over the last 15 years with a number of corporate crises, financial scandals flowing into the global financial crisis, environmental disasters epitomized by the more recent BP, we've had a number of corporate governance malfunctions, more general malfunctions, which have probably flowed into more specific issues of risk management and control within board of directors. The reason probably is that strategies were largely geared towards the maximization of shareholder value, as we've seen earlier, but the externalities created by these firms were not actually borne by shareholders, but rather by other societal constituencies. The need, therefore, is to recalibrate key decision-making in order to align them towards other goals, namely more socially inclusive goals and long-term sustainability. And I will argue that the way to do that is probably to include a public interest component in boards of directors in order to provide more sound decision-making and something that has been lacking so far, that is the democratic legitimacy of within these firms that actually create externalities, not just for the firm itself, but for a broader range of social constituencies. So if we look at what has gone wrong over the last 10-15 years, we've said before, there are intrinsic legal challenges in large public firms, especially UK and US type of public firms characterized by dispersed shareholdings. We know that there is the problem of controlling managerial behavior that results in two more specific issues, that of controlling managerial behavior. We've got both problems of internal control, non-executive directors, for instance, and external controls like gatekeepers or other market mechanisms. And secondly, there's the dilemma of the corporate objective, in whose interest corporations should be run. These issues, I contend, are made even more problematic because what emerged from the last crisis is that there is a lack of competence on most boards of directors, and the effective independence of directors, especially non-executive directors, is dubious. So how can we tackle these legal issues? If we look at just a snapshot of Northern Rock and BP, but it could be any other really firm that failed in the context of the global financial crisis, that gives you an idea of how those issues emerged. Northern Rock epitomizes the failure of the board of directors in understanding and appraising issues of risk-taking, especially after the bank in the post-demutualization years until 2007. As it emerged from the Treasury Committee report, the non-executive directors failed to appreciate the long-term effects of structured transactions on the bank's capital structure. They failed to appreciate the resulting liabilities and the interconnectedness that eventually resulted from those transactions. The business model, moreover, was conceived as a way to maximize returns on equity, effectively internalizing the gains of excessive leverage and externalizing the risks of that business model on other stakeholders and eventually on society. Similarly, BP unveiled float supervision of high-risk activities. We all know oil extraction. The question is whether CSR was more than mere rhetoric. Environmental legislations, however, were repeatedly ignored to pursue short-term share profits. CSR was only subservient to shareholder value, and the other interests of the environment, for instance, were not accurately pursued within the board of directors. So, given these failures, given the experiences that we can see from the last 10, 15 years of corporate scandals, corporate and financial scandals, the reform I propose would target those firms that pose significant threats to society. So it wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all type of proposal, but only those firms that pose significant threats to society because of the type of activity that they conduct. There are rationales that I've looked at in other contexts as to how to identify these firms. So the aim would be to redesign the structure of board of directors of these large public firms, and the way to do that is to mandate the participation of state in key decision-making. Now, before I go into how this would happen, how this would be achieved, the function of state in board of directors would be an equilibrating element of both social and economic interest, something that has been missed because corporations have an overwhelming influence of business ideology, of business ethos. And then it would fill, the President of State would fill that democratic deficit that has persisted, has caused a lack of public legitimization of managerial power. So the democratic underpinning that is intrinsic with state could represent the natural custodian of different social interests that are effectively affected by the activities of these corporations. So how in practice could we achieve enlightened boards? So this democratic-based intervention, this democratic-based social interest could be brought in board of directors through professionals drawn from a pre-established and permanent state-based body. The body would have to be institutionally independent, both from market and from government. There would need to be a predetermined career path, because these professionals would need to be equipped with skills and expertise to balance different interests and different stakeholders. So essentially, this would flow into a new profession. It would tackle that issue of financial revolution, for instance, that has occurred in the financial services sector and that has not been tackled. To draw an example of how this could impact in board of directors' decision-making, there are three more technical issues, for instance. Majority of these professionals needed for key decisions, power of veto, and, as I said, a broader intellectual dimension. This is a snapshot of how it could work in practice. I think the interesting issue is that that big frame of social constituencies could have an indirect participation or an accountability link, rather, with the decision-making of the large public firms through the intervention of the professional body. So moving towards a different balance in board of directors. So I argue that state intervention in board of directors through this predetermined state-based professional body could result in an ex-ante gatekeeping function, so breaking that independence from gatekeepers who are essentially market players, resolve the corporate objective dilemma because professionals would depart because of their intellectual background from shareholder-oriented rhetoric and would be capable of balancing different interests at stake, and achieve a new intellectual dimension and deeper understanding of underlying legal problems, something that has occurred. This lack of understanding, lack of appreciation of long-term issues is something that emerged both in the environmental disasters and in the context of the global financial crisis. Thank you.